engaged in, and what were your perceptions around cooperation versus competitive mode before you even start negotiation. And many of us tend to think that negotiation is quite competitive rather than cooperation. And you found that from the rock, paper, scissors, that cooperation was much more meaningful in terms of both of you winning compared to if you were playing in a competitive approach where we tend to remember how to play rock, paper, scissors. So I was telling a story about how I remember playing as a child, and even now today as an adult, some of us resort to it when we have to make a decision about, well, who's going to drive or who's going to take out the trash, or it could be very simple things like that. But in here, you realize that the game is not the same. In essence, that if you will cooperate and think about a strategy, you're more likely to win at the end compared to if you're just doing one-on-one competition. And then we talked about why cooperation is so naturally hard. And then we have to put in more effort to be cooperative than it is for us to be competitive. Some of us are higher in competitiveness than others. I'm sure you know people or have interacted with people who are more competitive than others. I can think of, even for some of my colleagues, we have social gatherings as a way to create a great positive culture. And one of the social gatherings is always these kind of games. And some of my colleagues are very, very competitive compared to others, whereas others are not. For those who are high on competitiveness, natural cooperation takes a little bit more effort. And that can be threatening for some people because you have to put yourself in a vulnerable position. And vulnerability is not something people want to feel. It's not comfortable. And it also is a little bit threatening to yourself in terms of what are the goals that you want to achieve. But some vulnerability allow for cooperation to occur, so that trust can happen. So that trust can happen if you're vulnerable enough. But if you're too vulnerable, then betrayal can also happen if your counterpart uses it to their advantage, or in essence abuse their power. And then natural cooperation is hard if you have strong emotions. And that's the part where I talk about in terms of competitiveness, or it could be other areas, such as you're fearful of trusting other people. You have these reservations, and they're very strong. In essence, breaking those strong emotions is much harder, therefore blocking cooperation to happen. The other piece that I talked about is these natural assumptions that we have about how we operate or how we tend to think in the way we behave and the outcomes it has on the world or other people around us. So I call this the tragedy of the commons. In essence, is, well, why should I cooperate? I'm just one person. Me not cooperating is not going to impact that many people. So I gave the example of recycling and non-recycling, or even just piracy. For me, I remember at one point in time, some people were very much into software piracy, downloading music or even downloading DVDs, if that's the case, or movies. And you're thinking, well, I'm just one person. But if we all share that same mindset, it becomes not just one DVD or one song being downloaded, it becomes millions of DVDs and millions of songs being downloaded, where the artists and the actors and the workers who put the movie together or the music together are not getting paid. And that has a rippling effect for everybody else. The example for recycling is, I'm just one person who's not recycling. But if you take a look around, it creates a mass effect if everyone shares that common ideology. So tragedy of the common is one of the psychological assumptions that we have that makes cooperation a barrier. And there's many other types of assumptions that we may engage in that create that barrier for cooperation. And one of them is the prisoner's dilemma that you engaged in during Win as Much as You Can. And here we talked about the different strategies that some of you may have employed during the Win as Much as You Can. And I asked a couple of you from the mid-course webinar, well, I asked all of you actually, from the mid-course webinar, which strategy did you initially engage in, as in that was your first step into playing the game. And I believe at that time, most of you were, I believe it was a soft grudger. It was one of the number 3 and number 4. And then the second follow-up was number 1, all's cooperating no matter what. And for those who engage in 3 and 4, we're more effective than if you were always cooperating. For those who are always cooperating, if no one defected, which is I chose a Y, X, I mean, then you're fine. But if someone defected and actually was not following the rules that was set by the team and was gaining more points, then your strategy of always cooperating no matter what wasn't as an optimal solution or strategy. Most importantly, you may even leave the negotiation or the game or activity quite angry with this individual, or even angry with yourself. In terms of your level of satisfaction, probably would be lower compared to if you actually started engaging in different strategies. And that if you go all the way a little bit down, there's different strategies in terms of tit for tat. They can be tit for tat as in, I'm going to engage in certain behaviors depending on how you engage. Or I can be a grudger in terms of a soft grudger or a grim trigger. And these are the individuals that tell you a little bit like, hey, play by the game and I'm going to punish you as in, I'm going to now defect until you get it together and you're going to follow the strategy that the team has set. Once you follow back to the strategy, then you can learn to say, all right, you're back on the game, you're following the rules, that's a soft grudger, let's get back to cooperating. A grim grudger, a grim trigger is once you defected or violate my trust, I cannot go back to cooperation. So you want to be careful for those who are grim triggers, because those are the ones cannot revert back and may have difficulties of trusting you, especially if you have to engage in another negotiation with them. Okay. So then I asked the question, well, does the matter of rounds, does the number of rounds really matter and a deciding factor whether you choose to collaborate or versus defecting? In this particular game, there was 10 rounds. Because there was 10 rounds, I hope that you were able to figure out that it was much more effective to collaborate than to defect. But if there's only one round, and that means only one time exchange or transaction, then most likely collaboration may not be the most effective strategy. Instead, you may choose to defect. And then I asked why. Many of your colleagues said, well, because you want to get as much as you can at that time, there's no need to really build that long-term relationship. If it's a short-term relationship and there's no anticipation to really interact with them again, then defecting will be the most effective strategy. So I used the example of me going to a market and buying an item at an open market, and then I probably will never see that person again because I travel a lot and I go to a lot of open markets. Very doubtful that I see this barter again. But it could be important or different in terms of number of rounds if I'm interacting with a client, and this client could, even though we're working on one project or one potential vendor, it could also impact the ability of continuous projects or other types of opening of projects and things like that. And that's what I consider when I mean of rounds. It's not just about playing a game of rounds of X and Y's, but if we had to translate this to real life, it's very much about the transactions or the interactions that you have with your counterparts or these individuals. And also it can extend even beyond just direct interactions. It can be indirect in a sense that if I was working with Stella, and my interactions with Stella was pretty amazing. And then I run into Catherine, and Catherine is looking for some kind of service. And I go, well, you know, I actually interacted and worked with Stella, and she was great. And therefore, I'm probably going to recommend Stella to Catherine, even though Stella and I will probably not work on another project together, or I will use her service again, because I may not necessarily need it, given that Stella situated me into a great next direction, and Catherine may provide use her service. So think about that in terms of direct and indirect of whether you choose to collaborate or defect. And I mean by direct and indirect in terms of possible interactions. And then I noted that there are several types of strategies as well when winning as much as you can that are very broad. The other ones are very specific strategies. And the broad strategies identified were two: dominant strategy and Nash equilibrium. And I said the dominant strategy is the one where I know that if I play this card or I choose this strategy, I will always win, or at least come out with the best outcome, regardless of what my player or counterpart will choose. That means either they choose to participate or not participate, or they choose to an X or a Y, I will still lead or end the activity with the best outcome. The Nash equilibrium is a little bit different. This one is that there's no incentives or no, in essence, I like saying motivation for me to really switch from my strategy of possibly both of us winning if my counterpart stays true to their decision, given that they themselves do not shift or change from the strategy that we have set upon us or that we have agreed in terms of negotiation. So I provided some examples, and this one's the dominant strategy here. And then I also provided an example of the Nash equilibrium here. Okay, so you can follow the arrows. In essence, I'm the green, you're player B, you're player A, you're the purple. And Nash equilibrium, you see that if I was originally in the far right quadrant, in the very bottom, I'm going to get 2 points, my counterpoint is going to get 2 points. There's really no incentives for me to switch to being a Y, because I go from 2 points to 0 points if I'm player A. For player B, there's no incentives for me to switch to a Y as well, because I go from 2 points to 0. So that's exactly what the Nash equilibrium is out, is there's really no incentives. That means I will not gain any more points or not gain any more rewards or monetary or whatever it is, the transaction that you're engaging in. So therefore, it's best that I stay here, unless I engage in collaboration. And that's a different story than dominant and Nash equilibrium. And collaboration here is what we call the global optimum. And this is where we both said, hey, even if we stick to X, it might be good if we agree and can trust each other to some extent to choose Y. And that's what win as much as you can is, the prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma, where it came from, some of you may know, some of you do not know, in essence of whether I like to say, do I rat my partner out or do I not rat my partner out? In essence, do I accept the plea bargain or do I not accept the plea bargain? If I accept the plea bargain, then my counterpart is going to have a harsher sentence than me, in terms of both of us are in this, for instance, interrogation room and a police officer station. But if we both decide to stay silent and we both do not confess or tell on each other, therefore, we're more likely to engage in a Y and Y, which is no one gets convicted or be found guilty because there's not enough evidence for the prosecutors to charge us with. But in essence, here, it could be that X and X is that we both may agree to a plea bargain. And that might be something that may work out or may not work out depending on what the plea bargain is. But in the essence of the X and the Y, where one gets 4 points and the other gets 0, is the one where I decide that I'm going to confess and accept, not just a plea bargain, but in essence, a asylum, that I will be protected and you will get punished. Therefore, you will take the punishment because I am now no longer a defendant. I'm going to be a witness. Okay, so just giving you examples of what these numbers could potentially mean in different scenarios. And that's where the word prisoner's dilemma come from. But ultimately, if we can find a global optimum, then try to use that strategy and share it with your counterpart. For you, it's very simple. You notice it because the off-point system is a little bit more obvious and direct. So therefore, you're engaging with your teammates, say, everybody select Y. It's pretty obvious. But if you're in a negotiation setting, this outcome or the selection options may not be as clear and evident. So you may take some time to really have conversations or understand what is the context involved in the negotiation. And if you're able to identify the global optimum, my advice is to actually share it with your counterpart. And that also increases trust and also sets a little bit of vulnerability. And therefore, you can give them the option to decide whether they want to engage in the same strategy as you in order to reach the best results for not just you, but for both of us. Now, what happens if people do not cooperate at all and you think everyone wants to play nice? And that's not always the case. We're very self-oriented and naturally self-oriented. It doesn't make us bad people. But one of the strategies that were identified as being quite effective is called tit for tat. And this was done by Anatole Rappaport in a Robert Exel's experiment. And it was a computer gaming, very similar to the prisoner's dilemma. And what they found is that Anatole, every time he engaged with someone that defected, he engaged in a tit for tat. He himself also defected, even though he initially started cooperating. So the goal is that he started cooperating, not necessarily starting off defecting first. He only defected if his counterpart did not follow suit accordingly. Okay. So in essence, it's not necessarily the first person to defect, is whether you play nice until someone defect, and then you let them know that this is unacceptable behavior. That's what we mean by punishment, is that this is not an agreement. This is not how we will continue our negotiation process, and kind of creating those boundaries. And you're thinking, well, how do I do that? And in what situation can that happen or will happen? And I'm sure that probably happened for some of you. Think about clients or people that you start off the negotiation and you agreed, for instance, that the price is set at about $1,000 for a particular piece. And then all of a sudden they come back to you and they tell you, no, it's no longer 1,000 piece. I have all these other things. And now I want to sell it for 1,200. And that's the original agreement that you had. Okay. You can either choose to change the service you provide, or you choose and let them know that this is not the agreement you've initially started with. And therefore you may even choose another vendor. Okay. Not necessarily to retaliate to be vindictive, but to retaliate in essence to set the grounds for what is acceptable behavior. So make sure you know the difference between the two. And then once they're able to come back and follow the cooperation rules, be kind, be forgiving. And hey, Zhao, nice to see you join us. Be forgiving and allow them to know that you are a very open-minded person. So some of the 4 features: be nice and fair initially, start off cooperative, be clear and transparent. That means share the information, let them know what area is vague to you or what areas need more information, or don't try to hide the key information that they think is very important to them. If they are in essence defecting or not cooperating, then be provocable. That means be clear, be in essence that whatever it is you're going to engage in, to let them know there's a sense of punishment, that it is provocable enough that it matters to them. So I give the example, win as much as you can. If you find that one of the players is defecting, just telling, for instance, hey, Jim, we all agreed on Y and now you're selecting X, is probably not enough in terms of provocability and also firmness. You may want to reach out and do a mass text to everyone in the group and say, hey, look at Jim. He's violating our rules. We all agreed that we're going to pick X. I'm just not satisfied with what he did, right? And that may be a little bit for some, not enough provocativeness, and you may go even a little bit further. You want to be able to make it very clear, and you also wanted to make sure that you hold tight. And what I mean hold tight is stand your position on what do you think is acceptable and not acceptable behavior. So if, for instance, they started defecting and you let that one go, as in you do not do anything, then they're going to continue to defect, right? So every time they defect, you need to be firm in how you treat them. And then again, once they get into it and follow the rules again, hopefully you can forgive them, okay? There are many other situations I can think about for tit for tat. This is not just about negotiation, about products or money or vendors per se. It can be very much similar to even the relationships we have with our friends or families or even our loved ones in terms of our partners. We let them know when they violate a rule that we think is important, that we originally agreed upon, the type of relationship we have, okay? And how do you tell a friend that they violated your trust? Do you continue to be always sharing information with them and you continue to interact with them as frequently as you did before? You may not. So to be provocable and firm, you may start to be distant with them. Let them know that your presence is no longer as accessible as it once was before. Okay. And not just doing it passive aggressively. That's not clear and transparent. You need to be vocal in your communication. Just say, hi, friend, I feel like you violated my trust. I share that information with you. I did not expect you to share it with others. Therefore, I feel like I cannot share any more very sensitive, important, personal information about me with you until you can show me that I can trust you again. And if they say, I'm sorry, I didn't know that was important and personal to you, I will not do that again, then you go to number 4, you be forgiving. So, I can come up with different other examples as well of how tit and tat strategy works, but we know that negotiation is not just about monetary, it's about relationships in any aspects. And if we can engage in this in an effective way, it'll allow you to interact with people and not just looking at just the substance of getting an outcome out of it, even though that is the goal. But people want to feel like it's more than just that, right? So I think we started getting into the trust factor, and we said, it's nice to have people to like you, but if they trust you, they'll do business with you. And that's what most of you are most interested in about. I don't want to be liked only. We are at this moment interested in how we acquire new clients to create new businesses and ultimately affect your bottom line or acquire new revenue for you or income if that's the case. So what is trust to you and what is trust to others? Do know that it's a two-way street. What I mean by a two-way street is what I perceive as trust may not necessarily be aligned to what you perceive as trust, and they can be quite conflicting. So we're going to take a look at exactly what that means in terms of the equation for building trust. And I asked some of you, what do you think the C, the R, the I, and the S mean? And I think at that time, only one person got the C right. We said the C stands for credibility, reliability, intimacy, and self-orientation. And self-orientation, if you're not familiar with that terminology, is basically that I tend to put myself first. Every action, every behavior, every decision-making that I do, or even intentions that I have are very much in essence to serve me, okay? Intimacy is about trust. It is not necessarily about connection of physical or anything like that. It's much about that if I share information with you, if I shared information with Catherine, I know for sure that Catherine will not share that information with anybody else without my permission. Reliability is that I know that Catherine will always come through what she says she will come through. I like to say this is in essence, she walks the talk or he walks the talk, if that's the case, right? So what you say is what you mean, and I can depend on it, and that also leads to us really trust, right? If we think about it as a whole. Credibility is that when you speak or when you present something, that you are presenting it with accurate information, and that you, at some instance, either shared it with objective points, that means data, or that you have some expertise in that area based off experience, okay? So credibility can come from 2 points. It could be from your personal experience. That means maybe I've been teaching for over 10 years. Designing courses is probably going to come much more intuitive for me. So maybe you trust my ability to engage in pedagogical as well as andragogical curriculum. And then another credibility could be not just experience, but it could be, for instance, my degree in what I have. So for you, if you're a salesman and you're selling cars, I've been selling cars for 20 years, right? I'm not only selling cars, I collect cars, right? So selling cars is credibility from terms of objective, pure fact and certifications. I've been doing it. And personal could be that I also have a personal passion. So I really am quite knowledgeable about cars, not just because it's my job, okay? Self-orientation needs to be low in order for trust to be higher. Credibility, reliability, and intimacy needs to be higher, and self-orientation needs to be low in order for trust to be increased. Zhao said, can we damage the relationship in future negotiations if we use this tick for tack option, or in over times it creates a positive result? Well, Zhao, I think it goes back to making sure you engage in the first 3 steps of tit for tat, is to being open and honest and clear and transparent on why you're engaging in tit for tat. It's not passive aggressiveness. I'm sure many of you have interacted with some people who are passive aggressive, and passive aggressive is that they don't tell you directly what's going on. They just start behaving differently, and you're trying to wonder, why are they behaving differently? And you don't understand, and you're less informed about your behaviors. You're more focused on their behaviors, and you start feeling more negative toward them because they're not giving you enough information to know why they are behaving the way they are. We as humans psychologically normally want to understand why people behave the way they do in order for us to process how we should respond and interact with them in addition to where we should put them in our mental processes of categorization. It's how we make sense of the world, essentially. So in order to address that issue, Zhao, it just let the person know why you're doing this. So I'm now going to pick X because Zhao, you decided to pick X, and this is unacceptable. So we all want to win this, and we all want to get points. And you want to get points and get rather than getting no points, because when I start picking X too, and then your other teammates start picking X, then nobody is getting points, right? So you see there's a sense of punishment there, and you're also telling them that you're all maybe willing to go back to being all Y if they are willing to switch their strategies as well with you, okay? So that open communication is critical. I don't think it will damage it if you're being fair in your punishment, and being open and communicating what you're doing. But again, fairness is also perceptive, and you can engage in tit for tat. And some people feel like now it becomes a competitive combat. So you're going to do it, I'm going to do it too. And it may be in essence sometimes not resolvable. Not everything is resolvable. I know that sounds a bit of unsettling to know that you may not be able to save or sever a relationship that goes bad. And sometimes you have to be comfortable and firm to walk away from it. Because if it goes back to the story of I've interacted with Zhao, and Zhao said my behavior was unacceptable. He no longer wanted to engage him in a negotiation with me, and he walked away. I'm able to tell Catherine or Stella or even Guillermo that do not defect, do not cooperate with Zhao, because it will essentially cut your relationship at a quicker pace, and it probably could have lasted into a better relationship and outcome for everybody involved. Okay, so not every relationship could be saved. Okay, then I open up it to the chat box, and I said, from your past experience, what are some barriers for you in building trust for you or by others? And I mentioned that trust is a two-way street. You know how I trust people may not be the same way. And what I say trust and how I trust is your criteria. What are your criterias or determinants of trust? Is it behaviors? Is it in terms of, is it communication? And that means verbal and nonverbal. I've interacted with clients in negotiation, and they said that I don't trust easy. And the only way I can trust it is if you share your personal life with me. And that means like, you know, what did you do over the weekend? Or it could be as an, oh, my kid is starting kindergarten. The more they know you as a person rather than just a transaction, they feel like they can know what aspects of you they can and cannot trust. They know how you communicate, and also what areas that you are not comfortable with. So that way they also can know how to push you towards certain areas that's closer to their goal. Catherine said, in my case, it will depend on the type of negotiation and for how long. Communication is essential, especially nonverbal. Absolutely. Have you ever interacted with someone in negotiation and they're standing like this to you and they're already telling you something that, one, I'm not sure if you want me to open up to you, or is that it kind of creates this power difference. And the power difference is that you want to let me know that you're going to be at a higher level of power than me. And for me, when someone I interact with already creates a power difference between us, you already said that we're not really engaging in collaboration, that you really want us to be quite competitive with each other, and I may not trust you as much. Short term and long term. For some people, the longer you know somebody, it does create trust. And then there's other people, the longer you know them, you realize you can't trust them. And you're like, what? How does that happen? You start to pick up different behaviors about them, and you may not be communicating about the fact that they have violated some of your trust throughout the process. Now, you're thinking, well, why wouldn't someone tell us that they violated our trust? Communication, there's a whole course on communication because we have difficulties of expressing or articulating our thoughts, especially when we have strong emotions attached to it, because it can be easily misinterpreted by others as being something else. It could be misinterpreted by anger rather than that you felt as your trust has been violated. And now it's time for me to rebuild that trust. Stella said, if the other side is knowledgeable on a topic we negotiated, he or she can be trusted. In terms of credibility. So you may have credibility, But let's create this scenario, Stella, that you're interacting with someone who is well known in this area of negotiation, and they're very good at it. They're an expert in that area. But one thing about Tim, I'm hoping no one in this, I don't remember anybody in our course named Tim. The one thing about Tim is that he actually retracts what he says sometimes. Um, and that could be, for instance, that he's very credible, he knows his information, but what he initially offer you may not be what he will offer again or hold his to his words the next time you engage with him. So his reliability could be low, even though his credibility could be high, and therefore you may decrease your trust over time. So your trust can start eroding, Stella. So I don't think for the in terms of the equation, it's just one about the knowledge. It could be just that some people are so knowledgeable, it can be intimidating for you. Let's imagine that you're negotiating a salary with an HR manager. Your negotiation strategy is going to probably be different than if you were negotiating your salary with the CEO. You're going to imagine that the CEO is more knowledgeable and more insightful and more powerful, and it may change the way you actually engage in negotiation with them, especially if you engage in a CEO that have a history of disruptive leadership. And disruptive leadership is one that can be they are very self-centered leadership. I can think of a couple that maybe some of you may or may not agree, where you go, this type of CEO, we know that their only concern is about money. And they're not really concerned about their employees. So you may not trust their negotiation as much as, for instance, an HR manager. HRs tend to, if you're not familiar, HRs are not the know people of a company. HRs are people who actually try to get both outcomes for positive outcomes for both parties, the organization as well as the incoming new employee or potential incoming employee. Okay. Zhao said, Mia could organize a course on communication. Oh yes, we could definitely do a course of communication. Catherine said, I had to negotiate with expert in highly technical issues. I was lucky to be able to even speak in the table negotiation as I was the youngest, only female, not in the area in terms of the content area. Well, you know, Catherine, if I had to decipher or break down your message here, the word lucky is a very interesting notion that you insert into your sentence, because in terms of negotiation and anxiety and self-efficacy, what they found is women tend to feel as though it's a privilege, as in to be able to have a voice and negotiate in a room, or even to offer any suggestions about what they want. Whereas men tend to view it as less of a privilege, and that they have the demand and right to ask for everything. And not saying, we're not going to generalize it to every man, to every woman, and that is not the indication of any research study, but we're talking about the general average of women and men. And I'm doing a normal distribution of a population, if you're curious what that is. And is that most women tend to undervalue their potential, and also it impacts their self-efficacy, and therefore their interactions during the negotiation. So Catherine, I would encourage you to think about that you had every right to speak at that table, regardless if you were not knowledgeable in that content area. You were there for a reason, and I'm sure you brought such value, more than you probably even thought. And I think if you had to rethink about how you could have done it differently, given the frameworks that now have been introduced to you, I am sure it may be even different. I think age is a stereotype, right? In terms of, are young negotiators less experienced or less knowledgeable than older individuals in negotiation? And if we go back to our first webinar and we remember the myths that the table of the X and the checks that I created, and we said that experience creates a better negotiation. But it also can mean that experience means I've been doing the same thing over and over the same way, the wrong way. And I used the example of the very first job I got, where the negotiator told me that, well, if you don't want this price of the salary, we have someone else lined up. Okay. And that line, because she was in a position of power and I was young at that time, very first job on salary, I was just excited to even that she would even offer me the salary. I immediately took the offer. And even though I joined that organization at that time, I didn't stay long because I was very unsatisfied. I felt as though like I couldn't trust this person, and a little bit bullied or abused through the process of negotiation because I felt like I was young compared to this individual. Stella said, women may be bullied during negotiation, even though some women are very capable and smart. Yeah, and that's the thing about cooperation we have yet to talk about is there is the vulnerability, and then when do you give too much? Because we want to cooperate so much, and women tend to cooperate more than being competitive when we go in negotiation. So for a lot of male participants in the negotiation course, they struggle really with cooperation. But for women, the challenge is not about just cooperation; it's over cooperation, giving too much, and then their capabilities and their in essence their cognitive ability, their intelligence gets overlooked. And in essence, that hey, whatever we want Stella to do, she's going to agree. We're going to talk about different strategies for both men and women to engage in that can be useful if your fear is about self-efficacy, right? Self-efficacy is not just a women issue. It's not just one gender, it's everyone's issues because it can be a combination of I've never negotiated before or I get anxiety when I negotiate. So we're going to work on increasing our self-efficacy and decreasing our anxiety. One of the greatest barriers into negotiation, regardless how prepared, how much information you brought, how credible and knowledgeable you are of the content, is anxiety. If you go into negotiation with this very negative affect, which is a mood or a perception about negotiation, like I don't even want to do negotiation, it's really exhausting. I just feel really nervous and stressed out. It's going to impact your performance during the negotiation, right? So the final webinar, I'm kind of giving away a little bit of sneak peek, is we're going to talk about how to change your mindset to prepare yourself even though you have all the tools right in front of you. So that's going to be an interesting final. My favorite is the final webinar. So we talked about elements of trust as well as beyond credibility and intimacy as well as reliability. And elements of trust can be in the essence of the receiver. So the other person, how do I decide whether I can trust you or to gain trust as from myself? And that could be expectations. Do I expect that you will cooperate with me? And that you will reciprocate cooperation with me? If I engage in cooperation, this goes back to the win as much as you can, and then all of a sudden you start off defecting, I may not be necessarily going to evaluate as being a highly trustworthy person. Expectation is everything. Expectations, in essence, of how you communicate. Expectations of do I come and give you a hug when I first meet you? Or do I do a handshake? Or do I say hello first? Or do I ask, how was your day? Right? There's people who have these expectations. And then there's some who are very to the point. I don't really need you to tell me what your life is about. I've had a varying amount of clients I interact with. And one is, what is today's agenda and what will we accomplish at the end? And that's all they care about. They don't want any fluff. They don't really care about my weekend. So it's not just about establishing your expectations, but also understanding others' expectations so that way you can act accordingly enough where it balances out without giving up your own expectations. And that's the tricky part, especially for cooperation, is that we tend to in essence, modify ourselves to really fit the needs or the demands of others' expectations without really holding on tight to our own expectations as well. And that's why it's going to impact your level of satisfaction at the end of the negotiation. So do know your expectations as much as the other or the counterpart. The risk. This one is really interesting. I say only when one is at risk do trust comes into a factor. I don't really have to figure out if I trust you or not. If it's a very low stake environment, only is when in a high stake environment. And this could be, for instance, I'm not worried whether I trust you or not if we're negotiating for a candy. I don't think we're all negotiating for a piece of candy, but we're, let's say, negotiating for $1 or $2. But my stakes and risks may increase. Let's say I normally every day interact in negotiation that range about $15,000 to $20,000 per client on services provided. That's my average. So I don't consider that as a risk necessarily to my revenue of my company. But if I'm interacting with a client who is my biggest client, and could possibly $160 million client for over a 3-year contract that could be continuous and renegotiated in 3 years for additional or double amount, now we're talking about a different level of risk. And here, for instance, the trust factor is going to be very important for your client. And because they're going to look at it as a huge investment amount, and they don't want to invest that much money with someone who they do not really trust. Okay, so trust is going to matter more when there's higher risks involved. Okay, uncertainty. Trust can manifest only when there's degree of uncertainty. All right. And in essence, that if I already know what's going on, I may not necessarily say it's trust, it's just I know you. But uncertainty in essence is that if I cannot predict what is going on or your behaviors, I may feel like I cannot trust you. This goes back to the point of earlier that we naturally want to be able to predict people's behaviors. Because when you start acting out of normality, then we start to wonder, and then we go, what's going on? So if I'm used to Zhao always asking questions during the webinars or even during our discussion posts, if all of a sudden I don't see his posts or any comments on the discussions, I'm going to start to wonder what's going on with him. The more consistent we are in our behavior, the more reliability goes up. And this goes back to the CRI formula. Uncertainty is related to reliability. The more you are reliable, the more predictable and consistent you are, the more likely uncertainty decreases and trust goes up. Okay. So how do we build and maintain, or in essence, restore trust if it gets broken? I like to say that concession is important. Give a little so that way others can gain some. And one way to do it is divulge information that you think is going to be meaningful to your client, to your counterparts, but it doesn't necessarily harm you entirely or them, okay? And you don't want to use it against them if they divulge information to you. So be careful on that. All right. As you're sharing information and they're sharing with you, make sure you do not use that information against them. And I can think of an example, and one is you can, for instance, say, well, all I have available, and I have to make an agreement by tomorrow, and I need a decision by tomorrow. Knowing that they have less than 24 hours to make a decision, and they're now being open and honest with you about their time frame, can be quite vulnerable for them. You can use it negatively in a bad way to destroy their trust if you give them an ultimatum, and the number that you gave them or the substance that you're exchanging is not in their favor, or their initial expectations of what was going to exchange, could be very damaging. Okay. The second piece is investing in time. I like to say this is very much like dating rather than speed dating. I use this example because if you ever heard of speed dating, or you ever been in speed dating, is how much do you really get to know somebody in 2 to 5, 10 minutes versus someone that really took the time to get to know you. Ask questions that let them know you're interested in getting to know them and what their needs. I'm not talking about getting to know their favorite color or their favorite food. I'm talking about what are their needs associated with what they want. So for example, the car, the used car sales exercise. What is it that they really want out of their cars? Take the time to really ask what's important to them, because not only will it help them, but it will help you in terms of what you can leverage in your negotiation. Zhao said, so expectations are crucial in any negotiation. It seems, isn't it? Even when we have that anchoring examples. Oh, of course, expectations are there regardless we want to say they're there. They're always there. They're always leaking around, I always say. But sometimes we're unaware we have expectations until someone violates them, okay? And that's where I like to say there's these conscious expectations that are the clear, the ones that we follow our principles. And then there are one that are not necessarily our principles of life or principles of how we operate, but they're important enough that they only get triggered if someone violates them. So you want to make sure that you're not violating someone's expectations as much as you're abiding their principles. In regards to anchoring, well, if you lowball me, then you're violating my expectations also. So I know in essence when someone is lowballing me, and that means you are now no longer lowballing me in terms of the amount, but now you're questioning my knowledge, my credibility as me as a person. You're not, I don't know, I take it, and most people do take it, as this is not just about the substance being lower than expected, but it's about your expectations of me has now declined in terms of favorableness. Okay. The last point is making a concession without absolute certainty. And you're like, what does that mean? I mean, give up something that you may or may not feel as though is going to get reciprocated. And that means I give up something, and maybe Stella or Catherine may not give up anything for me at all. You can think about this in relationships and not just clients. And unfortunately, we hear this stereotype all the time where men tend to think they give up everything for women, and the women don't give up anything and they still are happy. But that's another example, okay? But it was about giving up, and the more you give out without expecting anything, the more likely that you can build that trust, because that's where the self-orientation is low. If you can give up something without necessarily getting anything in return. I can even think about Christmas, if you're familiar with American tradition. If you can tell, Christmas is not something that my family grew up off, and it became something we adopted as we got acclimated into the American culture. And one of my very close colleagues said that I always buy gifts for people, and I do not buy them anymore. And I said, well, why don't you buy gifts anymore for people? And she said, because I never got a gift back. So she's buying gifts for people, and no one ever bought her a gift back. And I said, well, why did you buy the gift? Is it purely the kindness of your heart, or that you were expecting something in return? If you're giving it to get something in return, people tend to question the authenticity of the transaction. Therefore, it relates to the trust. If you're trying to understand why it's important to give without getting also, okay? So when or will can they trust us? These are just examples. I went through all these already for the last webinar, so I'm just going to pick a couple here. And one of them I like to say is, we ourselves initiate trust, cooperative behavior, which invites reciprocation. That one is on the far right third line. So far right third line is where I'm at. And reason why I like that one is that sometimes what we do is contagious. And that means maybe the person or the counterpart initially was not expecting to cooperate at all. But when you start off cooperating, you display reciprocity, trust behaviors, people naturally follow through, okay? And that's usually what happens. Okay? So try to engage in behaviors that kind of tell people how to engage as well. It's not just about what is important to you, but the way you engage, tell people how they should engage. So that's probably one of my favorite in terms of how we build trust. Okay? And then I share a quote from a previous participant, and I said, the interesting thing about this quote is really at the end. And he said that it's about rationality versus irrationality, and that many times we as negotiators going in thinking that we are quite rational people, and that what we decided or our transaction was quite fair. But in reality, the process may not be as rational as we think it is. It could be quite irrational, because we have all these assumptions that are kind of going through our minds. So, for examples, are we engaging in the tragedy of the commons? Are we engaging in stereotypes? Are we engaging in the prisoner's dilemma? All these assumptions that we have are also blocking our ability to see the rationality of certain contexts. So I'll give you an example. One of the previous participants in another cohort or course for negotiation, when they were playing Win As Much As You Can, and one of the team members kept defecting and was winning all the points, they were so upset. By the time they got to the discussion post on Canvas, they wrote this very long thread of how mad they were about this partner, this counterpart, that how dare they um, defect the whole time. And they just literally just, I would say, pour all their anger onto the discussion board. And I remember responding to it and saying, so how did you respond to that person? And they said that I didn't do anything. I just hoped that if I kept pressing Y, that they would change. And they got more and more angry as by the time they got to the 10th round. And they by the time, then when they got to the discussion, they thought they were very rational about how they felt about this person. And I said, well, there's many levels here that may be much more understanding for this person if we break it down. And that means, did the team decide that you're all going to choose Y? And he said, no, we didn't have any conversations before we played the game. So then I said, well, how is this person going to know what is the team's expectations of appropriate behavior? And then when they engage in inappropriate behavior, as you're getting more and more angry in the background, were you open and frank and clear about the fact that they violated some expectations? And he said, no, right? And at that time, he realized how irrational he was getting mad at this individual, because he himself and the rest of the team members really didn't set the grounds or expectations about what is acceptable and unacceptable behaviors. In essence, he was the one, ironically, apologized that I was being irrational about the situation, even though it didn't lead to the outcome that he wanted at that time. But I like to end with the good news. And the good news is that we all want to be trusted, and we all want to trust people. Okay. So it's possible to build trust even when it's broken. Some may take longer than others. Some are different in terms of how they build trust, and that's very important. And I like to say there's one that I trust you, and I will not trust you again if you violate something that are part of my elements of trust. Then the second type of person is, I will not trust you until you support one of the elements of my trust. Okay. So do know where a person starts off. Are they the one that I trust you until you violate one of my trust elements? Or I do not trust you until you confirm or support one of my elements of trust, of how you may behave and engage with them. Okay. Then there was the 67 Fish Pond Lane. You're either the seller or the buyer. It's such an interesting house when I think about this. Like, who is really building a house with a bird cage? And I go, well, that's because I don't collect birds. And if I was in the middle of this negotiation, I would forget about the birds. But the really interesting part about this exercise is how many of you start negotiating the birds rather than just the house. The birds became part of the negotiation process. But what I like about this exercise is what I like to call the standard traditional negotiation that we know of. That means what we think of negotiation generally is that we're engaging in distributive bargaining, that we tend to view negotiation naturally as a win-lose, a zero-sum game, but quite that competitive approach compared to the integrative bargaining negotiation, where we're here to get as much as possible. So if you're the seller, I want to sell it for the highest price as possible. If you're the buyer, I don't want to get it the lowest possible. And it doesn't even matter, how the seller or buyer ends with it. And the resources are quite fixed. You're not going to be able to necessarily buy everything outside of that house, but that means within the limits of that house, and also maybe the loan agreements and things like that are quite fixed. Okay. And it is very self-interest. So I'm going to be in the interest of the seller and interest of the buyer, regardless of how I portray myself to my counterpart. I'm in the end, I'm very interested in my commission, or in essence, the buyer who owns or the owner of the home. Okay. So there's not much about our profit, it's about my profit. And we tend to focus on one issue at a time. And that means most people tend to focus on the house or they focus, once they move past the housing of the price, they move down to the bird cage, or they move on to the location. In this case, it could be now moving on to the birds. Some people never make it to the conversation about negotiating the birds. But ultimately, you're not really trying to build a relationship with the seller, the real estate agent, or the buyer, unless you know that this individual is going to be a continuous buyer. And that might be a different story. Okay. Zhao said, yeah, very interesting. Is there any statistics regarding trust first or weight to trust in an overall population? Just curious. I don't know the stats on that, Zhao, in regards to what percentage is higher than the other. I do know there is types of ways we trust and build trust, or how people process trust. Okay. Maybe if you find it, please do share with the rest of us, and that way the next time someone asks me, I'd be able to share that with others. So you learned about BATNA and ZOPA, and some of you may have seen it before, and others as well. I now can give a framework to how I've been thinking and understanding the specific strategical pattern associated with negotiation. Now, some of this may not be entirely new to you, and you're like, well, I knew I need to set some kind of high and low and range, but this creates a more of a strategic process of understanding how negotiation will occur for you. Okay. So this is what I think for you is understanding the focal points. This, I like to say this is the most important part, because this is where you can leverage your negotiation with the seller or the buyer if you beyond just think about what are important to you, but what's important to the buyer or the seller. And this is where I said, did the birds show up in the focal points? Establishing your reservation and your aspirations need to be realistic. It's not just identifying a high and low. So when you identify your reservations, do not bargain yourself so low. Make it a challenging enough, but also fair and realistic. The same thing with aspiration. It needs to be also motivating. Some people set aspirations quite low. So using the example, I think it was Stella, or maybe it was Catherine talking about, it was Catherine who said, I was just lucky to be at the table. If you are in that mindset of just lucky to get a job offer, I'm just happy that you would even give it to me, your aspiration and your reservation values are going to be much lower, right? And therefore, your counterpart is going to have a different, you're going to have a different zone of possible agreement, and they're going to get more out of it than you will. So you want to make sure that you set an aspiration value that really represents the qualities that you bring. So in essence of salary, it could be your experience. What is it that was attracted to them? They must want you for a reason, okay? They're not going to offer you a position unless they thought you fit it, okay? So do know you deserve it, and you probably could even deserve other items as well. So think about what is important to them. That means it may not necessarily be about money. So that's what I mean by focal points. It may not just be about salary. What else is important to them? So for me, one of them is about teaching and resources and research. I want to be able to have research funding. So starting off with a research funding, that way I can pay my participants, my graduate research assistants. So I ask for money that is not about my salary, but money that supports my career development. So for you in your job, you may think about conferences, things that focus on your career development. What is important to you? So asking how many conferences will the company pay for in order to improve my ability to perform at your organization. Why that is a win-win for both of you is because even though you get something out of it, it's not tackling to salary, inflating in this position in terms of starting point for the next person, but it also says that you're invested in the company, you want to do your job well, and that if they invest in you, that you will be a high performer. So you can see the value found between both, okay? So if you cannot increase on salary, what else can you increase or change on that's important to you in order for you to be a highly functional employee or person, if you're thinking about salary here? Others I've seen is about office space and printing. I've negotiated that all my products in my office need to be Mac and Apple, not because I love Steve Jobs so much, it's because I really forgot how to use Microsoft. So it makes it really a learning curve and time for me. So now I've lost work time to readjust how to use Microsoft products. So that was part of my negotiation, and I got that as well. And you can also negotiate parking. Think about all the things that are important. So that is not just, it's not just about salary. Think about the things that are important to as well as the other counterpart in order for you to reach a zone of possible agreement. Now, one other person asked, well, how do we know where the ZOPA is? Conversations, communication, divulge information, ask questions is important, okay? So I'm gonna keep on moving. We're gonna run out of time here. right? So for the very first time, I mean, for the very first step, if you're claiming value, what do you think is your first option here? You should get a poll coming up now, and you're going to answer your option here. What is the very first move in terms of your claiming value? Is it that you make the first offer, you set a realistic reservation value, do you determine your BATNA, do you set focal points, or do you identify some optimistic but justifiable aspirational values? So what do you think is the very first step in claiming value? So just pick one. We're only going to do one poll today. And then we're going to wrap up the webinar. I really love the questions. I think I spend more time on the questions than anything. Claiming value. So claiming value is to expand the pie. What is the very first thing to expand the pie so it leads to a win-win, Zhao? Nope, not to be more logical, to engage in a win-win, to claim more value, and also to get more as well for you, okay? So Stella said to identify my optimistic yet justifiable aspiration values, okay? So Stella, make sure you just pick one of the polls. Naveen, if you see the poll on the screen, so that way you can pick it. Bao said focal points and OC. Great, objective criteria is what Bao is talking about. So let's see what the results are. Hopefully, Naveen and Bose, you're able to select it on the poll, so that way I can calculate it into the percentage in a second. Fantastic, thank you. So 38% of you said determine my best alternative, your BATNA. And the other 38% make the offer first, and then one set focal points and identify aspiration value. In order to claim value, it makes sense if you think to make the first offer. But if you go back and look at the model that I just showed you, it really starts off with setting your BATNA. And for those who selected the BATNA, you're absolutely right. And you're probably wondering why, because you need to know what your alternative is. You need to know what are the strengths of the other area and what is the weakness in this area. What mean in terms of this negotiation transaction compared to your alternative. They become your leverage and your focal points, and also establish your criteria for your reservation and your aspiration. So you should at the very onset is to establish your BATNA, then your reservation, then your aspiration, your focal points. Your focal points could be other things that are not necessarily associated with the salary. Remember, we're here negotiating salaries as an example. We're buying a house. Those are going to be your aspiration and your reservation points. But the focal points is what are the other things that can help you still get what you want out of it. Then if you get enough and you know enough, you can start anchoring and making offers, or wait for the other person to make an offer. Okay, so I like to say start off with this first step, BATNA, then moving on up. Okay. Second poll, how satisfied were you with your negotiation outcome? In the poll, you're going to see very satisfied to very unsatisfied. How satisfied are you with your negotiation outcome? And that means generally. You don't have to think about a particular one if you want, or you can just pick one. It could be the fish pond lane if you want, 67 fish pond lane, the consulting one coming up or that you finished. Okay. Very satisfied, satisfied, neither, unsatisfied to very unsatisfied. So let's see what you selected. I'm running on 5 minutes, so I'm going to end in about 1 minute. So let's see what everybody has selected. What are the results? Satisfied, 50% of you said satisfied. Fantastic. And some of you may be satisfied because maybe this was in your aspiration value, closer to your aspiration values than your reservation values. And then some of you are neither, and one of you said no. Things to note about is that you want to make sure what increases your level of satisfaction is fairness and not just trust. Did their partner offer a value or a transaction below your reservation value? Will essentially influence your satisfaction. Okay, so things that really influences people's satisfaction in a negative way is the one that I told you earlier. It could be, for instance, like, this is all the time I have, I can give this offer to someone else. Or other things could be what we call need for structure. I really need to sell this house. I need to sell this car. We're more or less likely to be satisfied if we want to just get rid of it, compared to that we have a reservation and a BATNA, which is I don't have to sell this house. I don't have to sell this car. And then the less satisfaction is there's no agreement at all. And that's because someone violated their fairness, trust, or equity. Okay. So with 67 Fish Pond Lane, even though it was about distributive bargaining, it was still much about claiming value and building confidence. So I hope that you are going through this exercise, learning how to negotiate in a confident way, know how to build your credibility as a seller or a buyer, and expressing problems that you had going through the process. Because I know some of you actually were not able to settle on a sale at all. And that made it very difficult for you in terms of were you not feeling not as successful as a negotiator. So this is the last poll and then we're done. Which aspects of negotiation did you find most challenging during your IDG activities? Is it asserting your interest and point of view, managing your emotions, understanding the motivation and feelings of others, recognizing and capitalizing on the opportunities that could be the focal points, establishing trust? Like, how do I do that naturally without feeling like a robot or someone going, okay, you're trying too hard, right? So tell me, which one was the most challenging aspect of negotiation for you? So let's see what the results are. I'm curious. This is my favorite poll of today. 38% of you said dealing with people who have different negotiating styles than you, and then equally almost across all other ones. Paul said, what is MCQ? This should be MCQ. Can you tell me what you mean by MCQ? Right? So 38% dealing with people with different negotiating. How do you respond? I think it's interesting because we tend to view, we know our negotiation style, and then we kind of, I like to say, spill our negotiation style into others. Oh, multiple choice. You mean multiple like selections? Absolutely. I like to pick one though, and there's a reason why, Bowles. I only want you to pick one. Okay, and the reason why is because as you go on through the course, I want you to focus only on one of your challenges that you want to improve on as you're going through the rest of the remaining weeks of the course. If you select more than one, you're going to overwhelm yourself. You're already feeling a lot of anxiety and stress. For those who are low on self-efficacy and high on anxiety as they go into these negotiation activities, adding more goals to improve in terms of which one is most challenging for you can be overbearing. So I like to say, pick one, conquer it, smash it, as like I like to call it, crush it, and then pick another one that's most challenging for you, because what happened to the most is now the least, and then a new rise of the most challenging will happen next. So pick one and move forward. So that's it for today's webinar of Q&A follow-up. I am so fortunate to be able to do a third, essentially 4 webinars by the time we get to our 4th one, a final one with you. And I want to just say thank you, express my gratitude for those who are willing to attend another webinar with me, and absolutely love that I have great internet today, and your energy and your engagement is always appreciated. I hope to see that carry on as you go on to week 6, 7, and 8. So thank you, everyone. Thanks, Bose. I'm glad it was a fun session. Thanks, Xiao, as always. Navina, Catherine, Stella, Gilliam, thank you all, everyone, for today's session. And as always, make sure that you fill out our webinar survey that will be available at the end when you close out of here. Oh, Josie, nice to see you. You've been so quiet up until the end. So I'm hoping to get more engagement for our final webinar out of you, right? Okay, thank you, everyone. See you at our final webinar.